very much. It's wonderful to be back. I was reminiscing that it was 2.5 years ago when I was on my way to Romania that I came to England to meet Andy and Catherine for the first time and see the developments and establishment of CBR UK, and I actually spoke in this room. So it's wonderful to be back, and we're very grateful to the church for opening its doors and providing the space for this message. It has been over a decade now since I've been in high school. Now, high school in Canada is what we essentially call students who are about 13 all the way to 18. And so when I was in grade 10, about 15 years old, I clearly recall a story that one of my high school teachers shared with my class about when he himself had been in high school. He said one day there was this student who was deemed to be an outcast that a group of students who were bullies went up to. And they grabbed this student, they dragged him out to the school's field, they stripped him naked, put him in a net, and began to hoist the net up the school's flagpole. Another student saw all of this happening. He was so outraged that he ran to intervene to stop the bullies from inflicting this injustice on this poor young student. And when he tried to stop it, those bullies simply grabbed him and inflicted the same degradation upon him that they had inflicted upon that first boy. As all of this was happening, a crowd of students was gathering and simply watching. And within that crowd was my teacher. And as he told us this story, he said, looking back, if I could return to that moment and I could take the place of anyone there that day, who do you think I wish I would have been? And he answered his own question by saying, the student who stood up in defense of the victimized boy. And indeed, whenever an injustice occurs, we have one of four roles to play: victim, persecutor, bystander, or defender. Now, we may not have a choice about that first role, that of victim, but we certainly do about the latter three. It is that those four roles, victim, persecutor, bystander, and defender, that we actually see in the Scriptures with the story of the Good Samaritan. The man walking down that dangerous road to Jericho becomes a victim when the attackers, the persecutors, those robbers come upon him and they beat him, rob him, and leave him half dead. It's the priest and Levite who are walking down the road and pass by on the other side who become the bystanders. And then, of course, it is the Good Samaritan who comes by, who is our example of a defender, someone who stands up and protects the weak and the vulnerable. I bring all of that up because tonight, really, we're gathered here to learn more about our Christian call to be defenders of the preborn children, to be a voice for those who have no voice. We certainly aren't the victims, the children are, and we cannot be the persecutors, we cannot be the bystanders, we must be the defenders. This evening I'm going to focus my presentation on three main parts. The first is I'm going to look at what the Scriptures say about the dignity of life, the beginnings of life, and our call to protect that life. The second thing I'm going to do is convey the gravity of abortion in order to establish the great need and responsibility for us to do something about it. And then the third thing I'm going to cover are the specifics of what we can actually do to address this atrocity in our midst. So the first section then, what do the Scriptures say about this issue and about human life and the need to care for that life? In the Scriptures, you could say we have both negative and positive commands. In other words, things that we shouldn't do as well as things that we should do. So for example, in Luke chapter 18, Jesus is asked, "Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus replies, "You know the commandments." He says, "Do not commit adultery." And his second command is, "Do not kill." Do not kill. He very explicitly communicates. And of course, we know throughout the Scriptures, the commands are very clear that we are not to shed innocent blood. And then, of course, there's the positive commands of things that we should do, such as loving one another, we're told in John 15, verse 17. In Matthew 7, verse 12, we're told to do unto others as we would have them do to us. So do to others as we would have them do to us. In James chapter 1, verse 27, we're told to care for orphans and widows in their affliction. As my colleague Ray Cunningham has said, who is more orphaned than the preborn child abandoned by her father and mother? Who is more widowed than that pregnant woman abandoned by her boyfriend and at times even her husband? These are the modern day orphans and widows that we are being called to defend, to protect, to care for. And it's very clear then that abortion is something which goes against these commands to love. Abortion is something which violates the command we're told not to kill, when in fact it's an action which kills, and an action which specifically sheds innocent blood. You can't get more innocent than that preborn child who the image of God is stamped within, like in all of us, but who has not even yet committed any actual sins. So we see such great innocence there, and therefore a great responsibility to protect that life. Now, some people will argue that the Scriptures don't explicitly say abortion is wrong. Well, the Scriptures don't have to talk about every single kind of murder. They also don't say do not inject someone with a poison which will kill them. But we can extrapolate from the Scriptures about the dignity of human life and the wrongness of shedding innocent blood, that to inject some innocent person with poison so that it kills them, we can come to the conclusion that that is wrong. If we can establish scientifically, which we can, that life begins prior to birth and specifically at the moment of fertilization, then once we know it's a human being, we can look to the Scriptures to tell us how we should treat human beings. So science tells us when life begins, and the Scriptures tell us how to treat that life, how we value human life. Of course, the Scriptures do make references to life before birth. In Psalm 139, we're told, "You knit me in my mother's womb, nor was my frame unknown to you when I was made in secret." In Galatians chapter 1, verse 15, Paul refers to himself prior to birth. Now, if we don't exist prior to birth, it doesn't make sense to refer to ourselves as having existed prior to our birthday. And yet Paul does that. He says, "God from my mother's womb had set me apart and called me through his grace." So from his mother's womb, God set Paul apart. I think one of the most powerful illustrations within the Scriptures of the existence of life before birth, the dignity of that life, is in Luke chapter 1, where after the angel Gabriel appears to Mary and tells her that she will conceive of God himself within her womb, Mary, the Scriptures say, makes with haste to go visit her cousin Elizabeth. And as Mary is entering Elizabeth's house, the Scriptures tell us that the child within Elizabeth's womb, we know to be John the Baptist, leaps for joy. Now, some people may say right there with John the Baptist, we see the Scriptures indicating the very existence and dignity and value of life prior to birth. And I would say that while that's a powerful moment, the more powerful moment and more powerful illustration of the existence of life before birth is not with John the Baptist, but is with Jesus Christ. Because when Mary enters Elizabeth's house, she does not enter alone. When she calls out, the fetus, John the Baptist, is leaping for joy in recognition that Mary is carrying within her Jesus Christ in the form of the very early embryo. And so Elizabeth says to her, "Blessed are you among women, and blessed is the fruit of your womb." John the Baptist, a late-term fetus, recognizes our God and Savior, Jesus Christ, in that very early-term embryo. It's interesting that in the church today, we put so much importance on December 25th, Christ's birth, when in reality, we should put as much importance, if not more, on March 25th, when God made himself man in the form of that very early embryo. So clearly the Scriptures convey to us about the dignity, the beauty, and the existence of life before birth. Now the question is, what is abortion? And what does it do to this life that we are called to be defenders of? First of all, in terms of some background, there are approximately 200,000 abortions every year here in the UK. Throughout the world, the Alan Guttmacher Institute reports that there are approximately 42 million abortions annually. I can't think of any atrocity that on an annual basis has wiped out that many lives. And yet year after year, that's precisely what we see happening with abortion. The scriptures are very clear, particularly in the Old Testament, about child sacrifice and about how God abhors child sacrifice. And I wanted to read for you from Psalm 106, which speaks to this abomination, which I would argue is present today in the form of abortion. I would say that this act of violence, which kills 200,000 children in the UK every year and 42 million children throughout the world every year, is very much an act of modern-day child sacrifice. And it says in Psalm 106, God's people worshipped idols, and this caused their destruction. They offered their own sons and daughters as sacrifices to the idols of Canaan. They killed those innocent children, and the land was defiled by those murders. They made themselves impure by their actions and were unfaithful to God. So the Lord was angry with his people, and he was disgusted with them. God was disgusted with his people who allowed the shedding of innocent blood that in particular was the blood of their children. And today we see with abortion that we are sacrificing the next generation, our offspring, to the gods of convenience, the gods of pleasure, the gods of selfishness. We are laying them on these altars where we are sacrificing them to these horrible things. Now the good news is that while God is a God of justice, he is also a God of mercy. And in fact, in that same psalm, it goes on to say, after God was disgusted with his people, he abandoned them to the power of the heathen, and their enemies ruled over them. They were oppressed by their enemies and were in complete subjection to them. Many times the Lord rescued his people, but they chose to rebel against him and sank deeper into sin. Yet the Lord heard them when they cried out, and he took notice of their distress. For their sake he remembered his covenant, and because of his great love, he relented. Because of his great love, he relented. And it's important when talking about how gravely evil and how gravely serious this crime of abortion is, we not overlook the great depth of God's mercy. And there are many illustrations within the scriptures of just how merciful God is, besides this section in Psalm 106. In John chapter 8, there's that very famous story we're likely all familiar with, where that woman is caught in adultery. And the crowd brings her before Jesus, and they want to stone her. And they ask Jesus about this. And he says, "He who is without sin, cast the first stone." And one by one, everyone standing there with those stones in their hands realize that they're not without sin. And so they begin to turn away, so that after a while, Jesus is left alone with the woman. And he says to her, "Has no one condemned you? Neither do I. Go and do not sin again." Now, in this moment, Jesus gives us what I believe to be a perfect illustration of condemning an action and not condemning a person. He is very merciful to her, but he doesn't say, "Has no one condemned you? Neither do I. Go and commit adultery as often as you want." Of course, he doesn't say that. He says, "I don't condemn you. Go and do not sin again." And so it's important that we, in trying to be merciful to people, we nonetheless still need to be just. God is a God of mercy and He's a God of justice. And so justice demands of us to be a voice defending the preborn and to expose the injustice of abortion, which means calling all of us to bear responsibility and repent of what we've been involved with, whether through committing abortion or through permitting abortion. But we need to then realize God will forgive us. In Romans 5:20, we're told where sin increased, grace abounded all the more. And of course, where we see this powerful culmination of where sin increasing, grace abounding all the more, is in Christ's death and resurrection. And in the 23rd chapter of Luke, as Jesus is suffering on the cross, the weight of all of our sins and pain bearing down on Him, He is in between those two criminals. And those two criminals begin to talk to each other. And the one says, we are receiving the due reward for our deeds, but this man has done nothing wrong. And then he says to Jesus, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingly power. And Jesus responds, truly I say to you that today you will be with me in paradise. Today you will be with me in paradise. And so the great challenge, the great art for us is to try to communicate the injustice of abortion and how grave it is, yet at the same time convey that no matter what we've done, if we go to God with a repentant heart, He is eager and He is willing to forgive. What I'd like to do in the next few moments is play for you a film about abortion that I hope you will use as a tool to communicate to those around you just how seriously wrong abortion is. It's been said that a picture is worth 1,000 words. And indeed, the culture that we're living in today very much is a visual culture. And as a result, if we want to truly understand how grave abortion is, if we want to comprehend just what kind of child sacrifice, modern-day child sacrifice this is, then I believe for us to put an end to it and convict others to join us in putting an end to it, we need to expose it. We need to bring what's in darkness into the light so that people realize it's a moral wrong rather than a woman's right. Just before I play this film, what I want to do is take you through a number of different images from social reform movements in history to make the point that not only is it reasonable to use abortion imagery to educate society about what's going on, but that it works not only in our own experience, but historically other movements who have tried to educate their cultures about attacks on human life have made use of imagery and have made use of imagery to great success. Have we all seen the movie Amazing Grace? Raise your hand if you've seen it. Of course, a very powerful film of William Wilberforce's efforts to change the law here in the UK and England to make the slave trade abolished. And he was, of course, greatly aided by Thomas Clarkson. You could say that William Wilberforce shifted public policy, but Thomas Clarkson shifted public opinion. And in the movie Amazing Grace, this actor plays the character of Thomas Clarkson. And as I've studied the abolitionist movement and watched that film, what became very clear to me is that in a time before photography, the abolitionists knew that to try to bring an end to the slave trade required exposing the slave trade, using imagery in some way to convince people about how wrong the action was. And one of the things Thomas Clarkson did in his many travels of speaking against the slave trade is he would travel with chains and shackles. And he would do demonstrations for his audiences, as he's doing in the film here, showing people how the slaves were treated so inhumanely. In the year 1788, a very powerful tool was created for the abolitionists, and it was this: a drawing of the inside of a slave ship called Brooks, which showed with the measurements of feet and inches exactly how the slaves were packed in like cargo. This poster was then put on the walls of pubs. It was put up in people's homes. It was published in flyers and newspapers, and really began to horrify people about the slave trade. In a book about the slave trade authored by Adam Hochschild called Bury the Chains, Hochschild makes the following remark when referring to this image. He said, iconic images have power because they allow us to see what previously we could barely imagine. Iconic images have power because they allow us to see what previously we could barely imagine. And he goes on to cite the naked, emaciated men staring out of the bunks of a Nazi concentration camp. He talks about the naked, napalmed Vietnamese girl running down a road. The lone man staring down tanks in Tiananmen Square. Iconic images have power, he says, because they allow us to see what previously we could barely imagine. If you fast forward into the 20th century, you have the anti-child labor movement in the United States. A man by the name of Lewis Hine was hired in 1908 by a group that wanted to end child labor. And he was an excellent photographer. And his job was to travel across the country to places like the mines of Pennsylvania and take images like this, of children working long hours, in dangerous conditions, being robbed of their childhood. And as these pictures were distributed to the public, people became uncomfortable with child labor. So much so that by 1920, the number of child laborers was cut in half from what it had been in 1910, only 12 years after Hine began his campaign of taking photos. This is a photograph of a young boy by the name of Emmett Till, who in 1955, at the age of 14, went on his summer vacation down to Money, Mississippi to visit relatives. While in Mississippi, he allegedly whistled at a white woman one day and said to her, "Bye, baby," as he was leaving the store that she worked at. Being from Chicago, Emmett didn't realize that kind of interaction with someone of a different race, someone who was white, would have such risky implications. And yet several days later, in the darkness of 2 o'clock in the morning, Emmett would learn of the consequences that would come when a black person would interact with a white woman the way he had the previous day. In the darkness of 2 o'clock, the husband of that woman and his half-brother showed up at Emmett's uncle's home. They dragged him from the home, drove him off to a distance, beat him savagely, shot him in the head. They then took a 75-pound cotton gin fan and began to take wire and wire his body around that fan, and then they disposed of it in a river. Days later, his body was recovered, so broken and bloated and mutilated that the authorities could hardly identify it as Emmett's body, but there was a ring on his finger that his mother had given him the day he left Chicago. And so they knew the body was his, and they put it in a coffin. They nailed the coffin shut and then shipped it to a funeral home in Chicago. Now, Emmett's mother went to that funeral home, and she demanded that the coffin be opened so she could have one last look at her son's body. But A.A. Rayner, the man in charge of that funeral home, had made a promise to Mississippi authorities. And that promise was that he would keep the coffin nailed shut. Now, Emmett's mother, being a very determined woman, demanded that he go back on his promise and open it. Well, with enough pressure from her, he eventually changed his mind. And when the coffin was opened, she began to look at Emmett's naked, mutilated body staring at his feet, slowly moving her gaze upwards towards his face. When she got to his face, she saw that his tongue had been choked out. His nose was smashed in as though a meat chopper had been taken to it. One of his eyeballs was lying on his cheek, and she could see the bullet hole in his head. Upon seeing the mutilated body of her son, Emmett's mother demanded that there be an open casket funeral. Because, she said, I want the world to see what they did to my boy. 50,000 people lined in the streets of Chicago to enter the church and view Emmett's body. Parents brought their children to this funeral. Black and white people wrote, and media wrote and talked about what had happened. Media, through Jet magazine, published a photograph of Emmett's face, and word began to spread very quickly what had happened to this boy simply for whistling at a white woman. There's a researcher in the United States today by the name of Dr. Clenora Hudson Weems, who wrote her PhD thesis and then a book on this incident. And in those she argues this was the catalyst for the civil rights movement. Not a catalyst, but the catalyst. She says in her research of black and white people who lived during the time of segregation, they credit this image and this story as motivating them to action. Now, if that's true, why today, in my many travels across North America, and in particular into the United States, where this is such a part of their history, why today, when I ask my audiences how many people know the name or the image Emmett Till, very few hands go up. But I ask my audiences how many know Rosa Parks, and everyone's hands go up in recognition of that tired black woman who refused to give up her bus seat to a white man. Well, Dr. Weems, in one of her essays, tries to provide some insight into why we are less familiar with Emmett's story and more familiar with Rosa Parks's. And she said historians, or Emmett's cousin rather, who she's quoting in her essay, Emmett's second cousin said, historians like to talk about the good and the bad, but they don't want to deal with the ugly. And the ugliness of racism is not a white man telling a black woman to give him her bus seat, as bad as that is, but rather it's the confident home invasion, kidnapping, and murder of a 14-year-old black youth, and the exoneration by jury of the youth's apparent killers. What's interesting is that this incident occurred 100 days before that very famous Rosa Parks incident. And Rosa Parks said she stayed seated on the bus because she was thinking about injustices like that which had been inflicted upon Emmett Till. Of course, there was also many other disturbing imagery that came out about how civil rights activists were being mistreated, peaceful activists being attacked by police and police dogs, and media was there to capture the image and distribute it to the public, and that helped shift public opinion. This is a photograph of a woman by the name of Jacqueline Sabarito, who in 1999 was hit by a drunk driver in a vehicle she was in driving to a birthday party. And of the people in her car, 2 of them were killed instantly. 2 managed to escape the vehicle on impact. But Jacqueline, who was in the front seat, got pinned down as a fire broke out. Now, the fire didn't kill her, but it did severely disfigure her. This is what Jacqueline looks like today. And she has become the poster child for an anti-drinking and driving campaign used in the state of Texas. Because what those campaigners realize is that a visual message is much more compelling, particularly to today's youth, than is a verbal message. This is an image of many graphic images used in the state of Montana, where they had very high rates of crystal meth usage. And in an effort to combat that, they began to put together commercials and billboards and posters which show the horrific effects of crystal meth use. Their slogan is "Not even once." And it's these graphic images that have horrified young people and shown an alarming drop in crystal meth usage in the state of Montana as a result of this campaign. This is a poster in my own city of Calgary in Western Canada, where our government is trying to encourage us to wear our seatbelts by showing us a graphic image of the consequences of not wearing one's seatbelt. Of course, campaigns to get you and me to support and share our wealth with people in third world countries inevitably show us these children and show us their plight, not simply tell us about it. And of course, we're likely all familiar with this very recent image of this beautiful young woman, Aisha, whose face was destroyed by the Taliban, who ordered her nose and ears be cut off by her family when she escaped from living with her in-laws. And she escaped from living with them because she feared that they would kill her. And this was the consequences of her choosing to leave from that situation. This is a young boy by the name of Ali Abbas, who in around 2002 was at home when 2 U.S. missiles hit his home. Most of his family was killed. He was not, but as you can see from this, severely wounded. His arms had to be amputated. He had third-degree burns over about 35% of his body. His uncle described Ali as rotting before my eyes, rotting before my eyes. And there happened to be a Reuters photographer in the makeshift hospital where Ali was. That photographer snapped this picture. The picture was then distributed to the world. And when it was circulated, it particularly drew the attention of the people of Great Britain, who were so outraged by what they saw that they began to put pressure on then Prime Minister Tony Blair to do something about it. He intervened. Ali was flown to a hospital in Kuwait where he was given painkillers for the first time in multiple days. He now lives in Great Britain as a member of the Limbless Association. So time and again, we see in history people victimized. Persecutors and bystanders want to cover up the victimization. They want to keep it hidden. Defenders always expose the victimization. They allow the world to see what is going on so people will be convicted that they need to change their behavior. And so it simply follows that with the victimization going on in the case of preborn children, it is the responsibility of those of us who are their defenders, who are their hands, feet, faces, and voices, to make visible to the world what's invisible, the injustice, the attack on their precious bodies. One final picture I want to show about victimization in all its bloody reality is, of course, an image we're very familiar with if we've seen the Passion of the Christ, and even if we haven't, likely seen many images like this. Our own God chose a very public death, a very brutal death, on the busiest day of the year, where parents were out with their children, and his bloody body was on display. And it is when we see his bloody body that we understand not only the depth of our depravity, but the depth of his love. How much he was willing to sacrifice for the sake of our salvation.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. That all men are
My colleague Greg Cunningham has said, injustice that is invisible inevitably becomes tolerable. And our society, and many within our churches, are tolerating what we just saw precisely because it's invisible. Because it is hidden behind the closed doors of hospitals and abortion clinics. It is hidden behind rhetoric like freedom and choice and rights. But therefore, the reverse of that statement is also true. Injustice that is made visible inevitably becomes intolerable. I have spoken about the commands in the Scriptures to love our neighbor, which include the least of these, our neighbor, the preborn child. The clear indication within the Scriptures of God's Spirit within life prior to birth. What I'd like to do now to wrap things up is talk about what we can do practically in this situation. The first thing I encourage you all to do is to make note, if you haven't already, of CBR UK's website. Of course, CBR UK being led by Catherine and Andy, who's just stepped out of the room there. And the website has a lot of information about how to defend the pro-life view. Tomorrow night and Saturday night, I will also be giving presentations specifically focused on equipping you how to respond to questions like, what about rape, or does poverty justify abortion? How can we scientifically prove that life does begin at fertilization? So all of those questions I'll be answering tomorrow night and Saturday night, but the website also answers those questions so that if you can't make the talk, by going to the website, you can get further equipped. So it's important that you get equipped. It's important the next thing you do is talk to people you know. Talk to your colleagues, your family members, your friends, and begin to engage society. Ask people, what do you think about abortion? Now, sometimes people can think, well, how do you start a conversation like that? Well, one way you can do that is look for things in the media, in the public square, that people you know may have already encountered, and ask them what they think about that. So, for example, the Economist a few months ago had this article which they called Gendercide, exposing the lack of girls throughout the world, but in particular places like India and China, where they have sex selection abortion, where they have female infanticide. And so this is a great sort of way to initiate a discussion about abortion. If you're at your workplace and an article like this was laying out, or a magazine like this, you could say to your colleague, did you read the article in The Economist? And whether they did or didn't, you either explain it or they already know it. So then you say to them, what did you think about it? And they may say, well, you know, I'm horrified by sex selection abortion. I think it's wrong. And you could say something like, well, I agree with you. I think it's wrong as well. Let me ask you, do you think all abortions are wrong or just sex selection abortion? And maybe they'll say, well, definitely sex selection abortion, but you know, I think sometimes abortion's okay, like the case of rape. So then you say, well, why in that situation? You see, right there, you have a discussion going. And of course, if you've already equipped yourself by coming to my next talks or going to the website, you'll be prepared to answer those questions. Another way you can initiate discussion is to wear the pro-life feet pin, the size of a baby's feet about 10 to 12 weeks after fertilization. I remember wearing that pin one day when going through security at the airport. When I walked through the little beeper thingy, I beeped. And so I needed to be scanned. And so as this guy's scanning me, he notices the little feet pin, which also I think were the cause of the beep. And so he said, what is that? And I said, well, that's the size of a baby's feet 10 weeks after fertilization. And he had this look of shock on his face. He goes, really? Wow, I had no idea. I had no idea. Another way I stimulated an abortion discussion was after attending some meetings with a board member of our American organization, Father Frank Pavone, a priest that leads Priests for Life in the United States. I had been at some meetings with him, and when I left those meetings, Father Pavone had given me his latest book, which was called Ending Abortion, Not Just Fighting It. So when I boarded the plane and sat down in between a woman and her child on my right and a man on my left, I started to read the new book. And shortly after getting into the book, I began to get sleepy. And it's not because the book puts you to sleep, but because I have this tendency when in moving vehicles to fall asleep. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to nap for about 20 minutes. And I thought to myself, When I close my eyes and I put this book down on my lap, do I put it face up with the title showing or face down? And I thought, Stephanie, have courage, put it face up. You never know what the people next to you will think. And so I put it face up, closed my eyes, slept for about 20 to 30 minutes, woke up, and the guy next to me said, I noticed your book there. Are you for abortion or against it? And as a result of that question, as a result of me having the book title face up, the man and the woman next to me began to have a very powerful discussion about abortion. So there are lots of ways that we can initiate conversation. The other way you can is to keep pro-life literature on you. Andy and Catherine with Abort 67 have a number of different little stickers and cards with graphic images on them. And those are powerful tools to have on you so that when you have these conversations, it's not just about words, it's about the end result visually of what abortion is and what abortion does. And in fact, Judy, who's with us this evening, has a very powerful story of how she was outside an abortion clinic with one of those little cards, just very small with a picture of an aborted child. And there was a couple going to have an abortion. And they came to talk to her. And she showed them what abortion looks like. And they're now carrying through with their pregnancy. And so a little baby will be born next year because she was equipped with the evidence, but then had the courage to make use of the evidence when the situation arose. The next thing I really encourage you to do is get involved with CBR UK in some way to help Catherine and Andy get the pro-life message out here in the UK. One of the things that they have been doing is what we routinely do in Canada, which is to take the graphic reality of abortion to the public square, sidewalks, busy areas where a lot of pedestrians are walking. And the reason for that is when we hold events like this and invite people to come out of their way, the kind of people that come are what? Pro-life, already converted, right? Now, this serves a very important purpose of you having a deeper understanding of the crisis, perhaps, hopefully, gaining a greater conviction to do something about it, and then, especially in the next couple talks, getting practical skills of how to dialogue persuasively with people. But if this is primarily what we do, we won't reach the culture. We need to go where the culture is, which is busy public places. So we take these lightweight handheld signs and we begin to give out literature and ask people what they think about abortion. This is my colleague Francisco here, who's actually spending the next 3 months in South Africa helping set up our new CBR office there in Johannesburg. And Francisco this summer was part of our internship program where he was working with other students in communicating the pro-life message this way 4 days a week. And one of the days when he was standing with those signs, a girl came up to him and asked him why he was holding the image. So he explained what we were doing, and then she asked some more questions, and he answered her questions. And eventually, she looked at him and she said, well, I guess I'm not going to kill my baby. He had no idea that he had been talking to someone who, in that moment, was pregnant and thinking about ending the life of her child. This is Cameron, also one of our summer interns, and when he was out with the team standing with the images, he noticed a woman just off in the distance just staring. And so he walked up to her, and he's trained to do, he said, what do you think about abortion? And she said to him, you must think I'm a horrible person. And by that response, he thought, oh, she must have had an abortion. And so he said, no, I don't think you're a horrible person. You know, whatever we've done, we can be forgiven. You know, we all make mistakes, but that doesn't mean we're horrible people, even though the things we do are sometimes horrible. And then she said, well, then you must have been sent by God. And he said, what do you mean? And she said, I'm pregnant, and I'm a chain smoker, and I just can't get over my smoking. And I think at this point, I've probably so badly harmed my child, I was going to have an abortion. And here I am walking down the street, and I come upon your pictures, and you come up to me and ask me what I think. And so for the next few minutes, Cameron stood there and dialogued with her, and by the end of the conversation, she resolved that she wasn't going to do what she saw to her own child. When we take our message to the streets, inevitably we face resistance. We face resistance from people who don't want to see the truth, and we face resistance from the authorities who want to censor that truth. And we have a common experience in Canada that you have in the UK, which Andy and Catherine have had in the UK, and that is we don't have free speech like they do in the United States. Just about a week and a half ago, 5 of the people that I've trained and worked with who are students at a university in Canada, at Carleton University, a week and a half ago, 5 of them were arrested for trying to set up these images and images like it on their university campus. And the same thing happened here, where not too long ago, as you likely know, Andy and Catherine stood with the truth, peacefully communicating it to passers-by, and the police came and arrested them. And I sort of wanted to wrap things up with what they've done and what they're facing in order to get across the point that making abortion unthinkable is not going to come easy. It's going to be a tough fight, and it's going to involve personal sacrifice. The very nature of being a defender is that you lay your life down for others. And if you look at social movements in history, all the ones that I talked about which used images, all of those movements, their leaders and the people who were in them inevitably were despised when they were alive. We only typically herald them as heroes when they're dead. In my many travels to the United States, every state I've been to, and I've been to almost all of them at this point, there was a Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard, Parkway, Road, Street, Avenue, Expressway, but 50 years ago, there never would have been a street named after the man. The same can be said of William Wilberforce and Thomas Clarkson, who we hail as heroes today, but were despised at the time in which they lived. So we have to get used to the idea that persecution is very much part of social reform. Persecution is very much a part of societal transformation. And I would like to read for you a quote from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in his letter from Birmingham jail, where he talks about the early church. And I believe what he says about the early church is very applicable to what we need to do when it comes to fighting abortion in the way that Andy and Catherine have done so. And Dr. King said there was a time when the church was very powerful. In the time, he says, when the early Christians rejoiced at being deemed worthy to suffer for what they believed. He says in those days the church was not merely a thermometer that recorded the ideas and principles of popular opinion. It was a thermostat that transformed the mores of society. Dr. King said, whenever the early Christians entered a town, the people in power became disturbed and immediately sought to convict them for being disturbers of the peace and outside agitators. But nonetheless, they pressed on with the conviction that they were a colony of heaven, called to obey God rather than man. Small in number, they were big in commitment. They were too God-intoxicated to be astronomically intimidated. And by their effort and example, they brought an end to such ancient evils as infanticide and gladiatorial contests. It is that spirit of the early church martyrs we need to capture in order to bring an end to the present-day injustice of abortion. We have to be willing to put the truth out there at whatever cost it is for us. And so I ask you to consider, what are you called to do? And what are you willing to do? Now, maybe not everyone is called to stand next to them, although some people in this room right now are. I hope in some way you're willing to facilitate this exposing of the injustice. Even if you can't be on the front lines, you very likely can donate money. Maybe you can only afford 5 or 10 pounds a month, but maybe you can afford 500 pounds a month. And I ask you to prayerfully consider what God is calling you to do to make abortion unthinkable in the UK in our lifetime. We can end it sooner rather than later if we fight it seriously. And we have a plan to fight it seriously But the two things we're always lacking, and I say this being full-time in the pro-life movement for 8 years, the two things we're always lacking are money and manpower. And we're in a situation in Canada where God has recently blessed us with, he used to bless us with money. Now he's really blessed us with manpower. And he's sort of still blessing us with money, but with all this manpower, we need more money. And so in the same way, for Andy and Catherine to be able to grow CBR UK, they need money and manpower. And I would say in particular, if you can provide the money, the manpower will come. Because with the money, then they will be able to fund more staff who can work alongside them. And so I ask you to prayerfully consider supporting them, maybe monthly, that's ideal, annually, and even if you can't at that kind of frequency, to give something to help them get posters and manpower on the streets with them. Before we open it up to questions, I would like to close taking us back to what I said at the beginning when speaking about victims, persecutors, bystanders, and defenders, and how the experience that my teacher shared with us when he was in high school and those 4 roles, how they are also evident in that story of the Good Samaritan. And in the very last speech he gave before he was assassinated, the great Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke about that story of the Good Samaritan. And I'd like to share with you what Dr. King said. He says, you know, we use our imagination a great deal to try and determine why the priest and the Levite didn't stop. At times we say they were going to a church meeting and had to get on down to Jerusalem so they wouldn't be late. At other times we would speculate that there was a religious law that one who was engaged in religious ceremonials was not to touch a human body 24 hours before the ceremony. And every now and then, we begin to wonder whether maybe they were not going down to Jerusalem or down to Jericho, but rather were going to organize a Jericho Road Improvement Association. That's a possibility. Maybe they felt it was better to deal with the problem from the causal root rather than to get bogged down with an individual effect. But I'm going to tell you, King says, what my imagination tells me. It's possible that those men were afraid. You see, the Jericho Road is a dangerous road. It's a winding, meandering road. It's really conducive to ambushing. In the days of Jesus, it became known as the Bloody Pass. And you know, it's possible that the priest and the Levite looked at that man lying on the ground and they wondered if the robbers were still around. It's possible that they thought that man on the ground was merely faking it and he was trying to lure them in for quick and easy seizure. And so the first question that the priest asked, the first question that the Levite asked was, if I stop to help this man, what will happen to me? But then the Good Samaritan came by. And he reversed that question. If I do not stop to help this man, what will happen to him? That is the question defenders ask. If I do not respond, what will happen to this weak, vulnerable individual who has no voice? By your presence here tonight, you are a very clear sign, I believe, of hope that you are a defender of preborn children, that you care about them enough to learn how you can help them. And it's my hope and prayer that as a result of what has been shared tonight, you will go forward with a deeper conviction, not only that you must act, but you know how to act to make abortion unthinkable. God bless you.